Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to follow up on the conquest of Central and South America by talking about the development of the Spanish colonial system. Here are your basic objectives for today. So, let's dive right in. As you hopefully remember from previous lectures, the Spanish and the Portuguese divided the world between them in the Treaty of Alcovas in the aftermath of the Battle of Guinea, establishing that the Portuguese had the exclusive right to the route around Africa and to settle on the African continent. This, of course, no longer totally works because now the Spanish also have a way to get around Africa with Magellan's circumnavigation of the globe, and so they would have to renegotiate this treaty. Spain also is now significantly more powerful, and so they would have the ability to defeat Portugal and to force a better settlement if it came to that. But in the end, the Portuguese were making spectacular amounts of money from their trade routes, the Spanish were making huge amounts of money from their huge empire, and there was really no need for them to fight it out. The Treaty of Tordesillas established what's called the Papal Line of Demarcation, which divided the world in half and gave half of it to Spain and half of it to Portugal. You can see the Spanish claims there in the purple and the Portuguese in the orange. The Spanish would then get, of course, all of the American continents and the islands of the Philippines, despite the fact that they're on the wrong side of the line. But again, specifics and details are not super important, and their map making was not spectacular. Portugal gets the little piece, the little nose of South America here, which establishes why Brazil was a Portuguese colony, whereas the rest of North America was Spanish. So, Treaty of Tordesillas established the land claims of both sides. The Spanish were mostly motivated by what are called the 3 Gs. We've established one of the Gs, gold, and glory has also sort of been established, talking about Pizarro and his adventures in South America, and Cortez and his adventures in Central America. The other G was God. The Spanish, of course, were Catholic at this point, and were looking to spread the Christian faith to new areas. And so one of the things that they did is they sent along missionaries, specifically Dominican and Franciscan priests, along with the conquests, in order to ensure that the Native Americans were converted to Christianity, as of course is proper. Unfortunately, these Gs don't always work well in conjunction, as we're going to see today, but these are the 3 motivations that the Spanish had. The Spanish government was divided up into viceroyalties. Originally, of course, because the King and Queen of Spain thought Columbus was going to die somewhere in the middle of this massive world ocean, they signed what are called the Capitulations of Santa Fe, which said that Columbus gets 1/10 of any fortune and is and gets to be the ruler of all the territories he finds. As we talked about with Columbus, eventually he was arrested for spectacular cruelty, and the Capitulations of Santa Fe were abandoned. Instead, the Spanish divided up their territory into these 4 viceroyalties that you see here: New Spain in the Caribbean and Central America, New Granada in northern South America, Peru in the area that used to be the Inca Empire, and the Rio de la Plata in what is today Argentina. These viceroyalties were incredibly sort of decentralized governmental systems in which the viceroy, sitting in the capital of the viceroyalty, would ostensibly have all the power of a king, viceroy, vice-king. But in practice, most of the rulership happened at the local level. There were these local councils known as audiencias set up in each of the major cities, and leading citizens would make most of the decisions without consulting the viceroy. As long as treasure kept flowing out of the Spanish Americas, the King and Queen of Spain were not particularly concerned with the rulership of the colonies, and so you had this very decentralized system, even though it sort of mirrors the absolutism of Spain that we'll talk about next unit. Here's our document about the Encomienda System, so take a moment to pause and answer the questions associated with this. As we noted, the goal of the Encomienda System was to Christianize Native Americans, but the reality of it was not that. For the most part, the Spanish were interested in extracting wealth from their domain, and so although the goal was to have the Native Americans work a portion of their time, Encomienda became more or less de facto slavery, with Native Americans spectacularly mistreated by their Spanish overlords and worked generally almost to death. This led to a spectacular collapse of the Native American population, and because they were being used as slave labor, it kicked off a debate amongst the Spanish about treatment of Native Americans. Take a moment and pause and answer your Sepulveda questions on your guided notes. Pushing back against Sepulveda was Bartolomé de las Casas, so take a moment and pause here and answer your de las Casas questions. Bartolomé de las Casas was a Dominican priest who was one of the strongest critics of the Spanish system. As we read in the previous document, during his time as an encomendero, witnessed spectacular brutality towards Native Americans and started advocating strongly on their behalf. Sepulveda argued for continued terrible treatment of Native Americans. In the end, Charles I passed what are called the New Laws of 1542, which did attempt to protect Native Americans, barred Indian slavery, prevented new encomiendas, but the result of this is the Spanish more or less ignored them. They went into revolt in Peru, refused to enforce any of these new laws, and generally went on treating the Native Americans as terribly as before. The fact that legally you couldn't inherit any new encomienda meant that they had to switch to a different system of labor, known as repartimiento. So repartimiento, rather than the encomienda system, involved relocating Native Americans from their traditional villages onto Spanish estates. In repartimiento, the Native Americans continued to live in their traditional areas, but they owed tribute to their Spanish overlords. That tribute could be in the form of in-kind payments, things like crops, stuff like that, but part of it was also labor. And so a portion of the Native Americans in each village had to go and perform labor for the Spanish. And because of this, the Native American population in some parts of the Spanish Empire started to stabilize. We could see the spectacular brutality and death toll on Native Americans, especially from silver mining and sugarcane production. And so we see a spectacular collapse in Mexico, although it does eventually stabilize. And in the Caribbean, the Native American population was almost completely wiped out. The Spanish, of course, still need labor, which leads to the rise of the importation of enslaved Africans. We'll spend more time talking about the slave trade tomorrow, but just keep in mind that the demand for labor in the Caribbean is what fueled this African slave trade and this whole triangular trade system, which we're going to spend much more time talking about tomorrow. In the end, the repartimiento system was overly burdensome, so take a minute and pause and read De Gante's account of this system and answer the provided questions. Despite his pleas, generally the tribute requirements were not lifted and Native Americans were treated spectacularly poorly. Over time, the intermarriage between Europeans, Native Americans, and enslaved Africans led to a very diverse group of people. And so you had a variety of different categories that the Spanish eventually codified into what's called the casta system. The casta system established that Europeans would be on the top. Underneath them would be mestizos, people who are Spanish and Native American. Then you have Native American Indians, and then you have enslaved peoples, and then some combination of European, African, and Native American would be right around the mestizo category. In practice, this system established both your responsibilities as far as taxes and things like that, but also the privileges that you had in society. For example, the criollo, held almost all governmental positions and controlled most of the wealth in the Spanish Americas. But this system was not as rigid as it appears on paper, and over time, the Spanish integrated in some policies, such as your ability, if you were a mestizo, to purchase a legal writ of whiteness in order to move up the system and be able to get the privileges and responsibilities of a criollo. And so, there were obviously a lot of ways to sort of get around the system. Often light-skinned mestizos would attempt to pass as criollo. Sometimes people who were mestizos would instead be Native Americans because they felt like the tribute requirements and the tax requirements were less, and they would so go live and integrate with Native American societies. And so the casta system, again, race-based caste system, but not as rigid as it appears on paper. In the northern part of the Spanish Empire, they established a series of missions in order to attempt to Christianize the Native American populations on the hinterlands of their empire and to make sure that these parts were effectively integrated into society. These missions were supposed to be These missions were supposed to be about Christianizing Native Americans, but in general, there were problems associated with this. The mission system, there were some elements of forced labor. You have a document reading about Don Juan Oñate and how he provoked what's called the Pueblo Revolt. So a Native American leader named Pope pushed back against this system and led a revolt that burned a series of missions in what is today New Mexico. And it led the Spanish to reform some of their policies, although in general they still treated the Native Americans relatively poorly. The effect of all this, and we'll spend much more time talking about this when we get to our unit on European absolutism, but the effect of this is massive wealth for Spain. The silver mined in the Americas helped fuel the Spanish Empire. The Spanish Empire became the sort of center of art, culture, learning, things like that. We get stories like Don Quixote coming out of this. We get El Greco and Velázquez creating masterpieces, and so we get this sort of Spanish Renaissance of art, culture, music, things like that. And the Spanish Habsburg family becomes the leading ruling family of Europe. Philip II was probably the most important of these kings, who controlled Spain and the entire American continent, or the entire Spanish-American continent, and also the Philippines. This is the first time where we hear the phrase "the sun never set," or an empire on which the sun never sets, because at some point the sun is up in some part of the Spanish Empire. And so Philip II, we'll talk much more about him again when we get to Spanish absolutism. And then the Spanish Empire eventually went into decline through a combination of financial mismanagement and spending on massive fleets of ships and wars. But again, we'll talk much more about that when we get into Spanish absolutism. So that's the basic structure of the Spanish Empire. Hopefully you can answer the questions associated with these documents. And when we come back next time, we'll talk much more about the rise of the use of chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Thank you for listening.